Okay, this week we're going to talk about what's happening in Europe between the 1300s and the 1500s. And I mean, there's lots going on, but I'm mostly going to be concentrating on the Renaissance. And if you break up this word, and let me see if I can write this, um, break it up this way. Re means again, and nascence is sort of like natal, so a rebirth, and that's really what the Renaissance actually means. It's a rebirth really of classical learning. Um, it started in Florence, and it was really related to the rise of money and wealth that was taking place in Italy and in Florence in particular. And it started when a group of people living in Florence became the bankers of the popes. And what the popes allowed them to do was collect taxes for the Pope, and then the bankers got to keep some, and then they transferred it to the popes, and of course they took care of the money in Rome as well. And what they ended up doing with a lot of their money is they acted as patrons, almost like what was happening in the Roman period, where they used their money to build up great art, literature, and so on. And what you also find, probably no big surprise, is during this period, those who were wealthy became those who were the most powerful in terms of politics and everything else that goes along with that. When you read through the secondary literature, you get a lot of different terms that are sort of floating around about what's going on. You do see a number of communes being designed during this period, and this really means at this point a group of people living together and sort of doing the same thing, so maybe working in the same field and so on. You also get another term called oligarchy, and that just means the rule of a few. And this is especially the case in some of these early statelets that are forming in Italy during this time, where you've got the very wealthy patrons who are ruling over the people. You do get the creation of a city-state, and we talked about the definition of a city-state a number of weeks ago, where each city is in control of a surrounding area, and there's usually a few people in control of that city. And it differs from maybe a neighboring city, which has a different ruler and a different area that they control. So there's not really, what I'm saying here is there's not one ruler over all of Italy. You have military rulers, you've got the signori, which are the political rulers. And then what they end up doing with a lot of this wealth is building their own palaces. And if you ever get to go to Italy, you will see a number of these. And this is just a map of these Italian city-states during this period. The Renaissance is an interesting area, or an interesting era to study, because people seemed, at least from the text that we have, people seem to be recognizing that they were living in this new time period. And part of what was going on here is that the Italians were sort of reintroduced to classical texts. They were reintroduced to the archaeology, which was really surrounding them from the Roman period. And they realized how big and great the Roman period was, and they wanted to be like that. So as I put here, is really they were yearning for the classical period. And we might look at this next week, but where they're getting these classical texts from is really from the Islamic world, where in Islamic held territories, they preserved a lot of these classical texts. And then you get interaction between Christian scholars and Muslim scholars, especially in Spain. And a lot of these classical texts are reintroduced into Europe, and then they're translated into Latin usually, and then a whole bunch of people realize that there are all these new classical texts, and this is really the beginning of all this. Now you have some sub-movements within the Renaissance period called Humanism, or one is called Humanism, as I put here, emphasizes the dignity and worth of the individual. This is a little bit different from the religious history that had been happening this time, where it wasn't really on the individual, it was really on the collective. You do see a bit of education in the women, and there's some interesting scholarship on the Renaissance and how it really wasn't a Renaissance for women. It was mostly for wealthy men. But in terms of women getting some education, as I put here, is really moral education related to religion. And what they're not being taught, at least in general, there's always exceptions to this, rhetoric and logic were considered to be sort of high-level thinking, and women were believed to not be able to do that, which of course is not true, but that's what the period that we're talking about. You get a whole bunch of ideas about living in an area and you are part of that area. So this seems kind of odd to think about for modern people, but for ancient people, you were just sort of living in your village doing your own thing and you weren't totally aware of what was going on in the outside world. This starts to change during the Renaissance period. And because of all the introductions of these new classical texts, you get the reintroduction of the idea of citizenship, especially coming from the Roman period, and social leadership. And then you get education changing with a focus on the classical period. And what's really interesting is humanism can be divided into sort of two major groups. One is the religious humanism. One you might want to call secular humanism, where it tries to separate what people are doing from the religion that they were believing. And these secular humanists really stress, as I put here, human control rather than divine control. And this is very different. This will ultimately lead to the Reformation, which unfortunately we won't be covering in this class. If you take the World History 2, you'll probably start with the Reformation. But that was really a breaking up of some of the religious control that the Catholic Church had. And this is sort of the beginning of that. You also have probably one of the more famous people coming out of the Renaissance, which is Machiavelli. He was part of this movement, especially in terms of governing. Now, he wrote a lot of different materials. He was also considered to be a philosopher, but his book called The Prince really became famous during this period because it talked about how leaders should rule. And instead of ruling by religion, they should rule by the science of governing. And The Prince is really about how to get the power and keep it. Machiavelli had sort of a negative view of humans, that they were naturally selfish, and because they are selfish, they can do bad things. So you need a government to control those naturally selfish urges. And he also had the very famous saying, it's better to be feared as a leader than loved. And many, especially Italian leaders, and this spread throughout Europe, really took this as sort of their Bible of ruling. And going back to the previous slide where we talked about citizenship, patriotism also gets injected into this. And again, it's all based on the Roman model. Now, some of the classical texts that were coming out were also Greek, and so you get this reintroduction of Greek literature. And as I put down here, you got the reintroduction of Plato, and if you've taken any type of Western philosophical class, you know exactly who Plato is. And Plato is probably the most influential philosopher in the Western world. And that's primarily coming out of the Renaissance period where he's reintroduced. And I already talked about Christian humanism before. It's really based on the Bible with classical ideas sort of interjected into this. And Erasmus was one of the early movers of this. There are some issues going on in Christianity, which we really haven't talked about before this period, but the Catholic Church was very, very powerful. And you see some of their power declining during this period, and this will certainly be challenged, or their power will be challenged during the Reformation. You have popes sort of infighting, and multiple popes at the same time. There's a very famous episode called the Babylonian Captivity, where the popes are not powerful enough to remain in Rome, and they're kept in France for a period of time. And then soon after that, you have 3 popes ruling all at the same time. So what you're really seeing is the rise of, maybe you might want to call it secularism, sort of this reduction of the power that religion had on people, and then the reduction of religion and the rise of secularism during this period. There are also a number of things that come out of the Renaissance. So there's this great injection of money into Italy. A lot of the signores or the rulers are patrons, so they give a lot of money to, creating the statues and the palaces and the literature. Also in terms of allowing people to invent different things. And probably the most famous invention coming out of the Renaissance that affects us even today is the Gutenberg press, where in the past, if you wanted to print a book, you had to set up the letters, these metal letters, one on top of each other, and then stamp the paper, pull the paper off, pull all the letters off, and do the same thing. This press was built to really mass produce books. And of course, what this did is it created a demand for paper. So you get paper trade happening at this point. No big surprise, with the rise of the number of books, you get literacy rates going up. So lots of people were able to read during this period. You have maybe not so much an invention, but the sort of the rediscovery of the body, or discovering more and more of what was happening within the body. Vesalius was one of the sort of movers and shakers during this period. He started doing dissections on cadavers, and this was sort of a no-no even during this period because of the Catholic Church. They didn't want the body being cut up and looked at. And then, of course, you have very famous people like Christopher Columbus doing discoveries, Francis Drake doing discoveries as well, and of course Leonardo da Vinci creating these amazing works of art. Speaking of that, if you look at paintings that were created before the Renaissance and paintings sort of created towards the end, you can definitely see that this swing from religious artwork to sort of works of nature, where you just have like a pile of fruit or people walking through a field that has nothing to do with nature. And again, it goes along with sort of the reduction of the power of religion during this period. And I just mentioned Da Vinci, you got Raphael, Michelangelo, and no big surprise, with the reintroduction of classical learning, you get the sort of basic study of archaeology coming, and the Italians start building their buildings based on the Roman model. So architecture was definitely changing at this time as well. When you think about the effects of the Renaissance, so you have the religious aspect not totally removed, but it's starting to be removed, where humans are controlling their own world. It's not a God controlling people and controlling the world. You sort of get human freedom and expression coming out. Now, there are lots of issues with that, because in a lot of places you couldn't write certain things, especially about the church, but you have people doing that, and it's breaking the barrier that was down. And of course, you have artwork. I really should have put art/archaeology because of the reintroduction of these classical Roman and Greek texts. This changes art, it changes literature, it changes archaeology, and so